Welcome, everyone. I'm John Annis with the Charles and Marjorie Burancik Foundation. I'm located in Sarasota, Florida. I am a proud Aspen Ascend Fellow, and I will be moderating today's session. I want to thank you again for joining us, and a huge thanks to the United Way team for making the summit happen. Linda with the United Way is part of our crew, and she's hiding in the background, monitoring our space to make sure I don't screw anything up. If I do, she'll post a comment or something and fix it. If we have any technical issues, she'll also help with that. If you have any questions throughout the session, please do type them in the chat box and we'll do our best to get to those. I mentioned the Burancik Foundation. We are a private family foundation primarily focused on student success, social wellness, financial empowerment, unity through the arts, and environmental stewardship. Personal note, I am a new grandpa, or relatively new, 14 months old. Amaya, my little sweetheart, I promise you she will be the most spoiled child in the world when I'm through, and I've got off to an early start. I do not want to keep you away from our panelists because United Way has lined up an exceptional group. I'm going to ask them each to introduce themselves, share a little bit about their organizations, and maybe something personal. Let's start with Sven Schumacher, the Executive Director of Lutheran Child and Family Services. Sven.
Yeah, hello. Glad to be with all of you out there in the field, and thanks for everything you do. And 2Gen has been a big part of my life, actually longer than I thought. And so I have been at Lutheran Child and Family Services. Many of you might in the community know it really as Lutherwood, the children's home, for 25 years. And I'm originally, if you wonder about the accent, I'm originally from Germany. And I came in 1985 to Indianapolis and worked mainly in the areas of mental health and children, and have been a big fan of the United Way since we have been introduced to the United Way more than 35 years ago, when we were here with an international group of social workers. And one day they brought us up to North Meridian Street from the IU School of Social Work, and they said, we want to show you something unique. And of course, for all of us that were from Germany and Sweden, Denmark, and Thailand and South Africa, we never known something like that, and I was always intrigued about it. And so I'm married to another social worker, and her name is Shannon, and she is the CEO of brand new CEO of the Villages. And then we have a 13-year-old who is a 7th grader.
Wow, thank you very much for sharing. Dean. Dean is the Chief Program Officer at the John H. Bonner Neighborhood Centers. Dean?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be with you all. I, again, am with the John Bonner Neighborhood Centers, and I've been here just at 12 years, or 20 years, minus a few where I took away 2 years out of that track of time. So I'm really happy to be with you all this afternoon. The Bonner Center, we are a community center here on the Near East Side, been operating since 1971, really supporting neighbors, improving their quality of life by providing tools for change and growth. And it's, in that work that 2Gen really has the greatest opportunity for us. But as a center, we have programming for all ages, beginning with our early childhood work, supporting families at the local child care centers here in our neighborhood, but then all the way through seniors. We have housing that supports families. We have an exceptional fitness facility for our health and wellness areas, and then all of our adult services really supporting individuals to financial stability. But not only that, wealth building and wealth creation opportunities. And the neat thing for us is that how are we pulling all of those assets, organizational assets together to improve the outcomes for our families? And so I look forward to talking with you all today.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Dr. Joseph Paulus is the Director of Programs and Evaluation at Fathers and Family Center. Dr. Paulus.
Thank you. Fathers and Family Center serves, fathers, obviously, and families. We provide assistance to fathers to build their self-sufficiency and to become better parents, providers, and partners. We do that through a 3-week class for fathers and an ongoing class for mothers or women associated with the fathers we serve. And our whole goal is ultimately to improve the life chances of children. So our services are geared toward helping fathers to get better in what they're doing, as well as mothers, including job placement, training, counseling and therapy, and job search assistance. So that's in a nutshell what we do. I've been with Fathers and Families now for 3 years, and this was my first foray into social services again since roughly 1991. So it was my history of working here is my history of working with 2Gen organizations.
Wow. The little personal tidbit you want to share with us, or do you want us to make something up?
I'm a father of 4, ranging from my soon-to-be college student to my 7-year-old.
Wow.
So, yeah. And I got a late start, too. It's sort of amazing. Love every single one of them,
Congratulations.
So I guess I practice what I preach is what I'm saying.
Yes, well done. For our audience members, I have prepared a series of questions that I'm going to walk through with our panel. But most important to all of us is that we answer the questions you have. So if you have questions, please do toss them in the chat box, and Linda will help us stay organized. And we will certainly leave time at the end for questions. When we all agreed to do this, we didn't know that we were the last panel of the day. So for the 3 of you that are still hanging on, we really do appreciate you. Stick with it. We're going to make it worth your time. And we really do look forward to hoping that you can get something out of this panel discussion. So let's start with, and I'm going to start with Dr. Paulus. We'll go in kind of reverse order. When you personally became aware of kind of the 2Gen approach, how did that happen? Was it already happening in your organization, or did you bring it? Kind of give us the evolution of your introduction to 2Gen.
2Gen. It's been part of what we do. Our primary customer is the father, but that's always been with an eye toward improving the lives of the children. We have been doing family programming, things like family nights where we'll bring everybody together to celebrate accomplishments and do something fun. We've been doing that for years, decades even. But only recently, with the United Way's kind of emphasis on 2Gen work, have we really kind of dove into getting more intentional about what we do and being very clear that we're serving not just fathers, but fathers, mothers, and their children. So that's kind of how we came to this.
So maybe you were doing the work, but it wasn't formally called 2Gen. It certainly wasn't under the Aspen umbrella with the United Way. It was
Exactly
a process that you worked through. Dean, what about for you and in your organization?
So we began, I think we started hearing the term officially 2Gen probably back in 2014. We were one of the grantees with United Way, Central Indiana, and the Seymour Family Institute, and really trying to address student mobility and the impacts that it's having on students at our community schools. And so we, with our youth program, we were already in partnership with 3 of our local elementary schools. And it was from there that we said, and many of those had the highest mobility rates for IPS schools. And so it was great timing. So we partnered with the school administrator and social worker as families were presenting with housing challenges or already in a shelter, helping them to financially stabilize and to kind of stay in place, or at least have a planned move as opposed to just stopping, and so that there was a time for a transition to happen. Now, I will say that how the terminology happens 2Gen, and so we do that. We work with kids, we work with adults, but it wasn't until really our work with Great Families 2020 that we really this is 2Gen. That was we were in the neighborhood of 2Gen with the SEMER program, but of course, the Great Families 2020 really helped us think about how do we do this. And so, in addition to the Great Families work, we have our housing stability for school success. As part of Bonner, we do have a housing stock. And so we initially started this effort really where we were leveraging all assets, agency assets on behalf of families with our housing stability for school success. Probably in 2016, we transitioned 65 of our units in scattered site housing in the community to incorporate families. And so those families, as a part of the program, have a child at least at one of our partner elementary schools. And so really trying to, again, address student mobility and attendance and all of those kinds of challenges that we're presenting at the schools by providing a safe space, an affordable space for the entire family so that students would be able to focus, parents would be able to focus on those broader goals and not just the keeping the roof over the head, and allowing them to kind of step into their future stories in a way that is less stressful, I would say. And so, again, 2014 is where we began, and we just kind of began tweaking and refining our services and programming to better support families. And so as of today, we've grown that 65 unit program to 95 units. We just launched this year a 30 unit apartment complex that is directly across the street from one of our partner schools. And we have a specific coaching team that supports that the entire family, those 30 families.
So a quick trivia question for you. I hate to put you on the spot, but do you know where the Seamers live part of the year?
Sarasota,
Florida. So it's funny that I know them and I've met them, and I will be sure to let them know that you brought them up and talked about how wonderful the program is and how much you appreciate their support. So
absolutely.
That may have stressed out a little bit of what you said, but I will be glad to add that. So I'm making a note to myself right now. Sven, what about you? Your introduction to Gen?
Yeah, I think I have came to that in many different ways. Personally, I of course have grown up in a family that had several generations, and my grandmother played always an important role, and in us growing up, and so it was not a difficult model to kind of put my arms around it. And then in the late after I came here from Germany, I did a graduate program over at Butler in marriage and family therapy. And family therapy, especially family therapy, deals a lot with the family system. And I think the early idea was there that many times challenges in families are beyond what we often call the identified patient. And real solutions to some of the challenges might be really to bring families together. Interestingly, for us at Lutheran Child and Family Services, it was not necessarily something that was in our DNA, because if you look at the history of child welfare was very focused on the child and on their personal welfare, and often enough the parents were not even part of the picture. They kind of in a way messed up, or parental rights were terminated, and it was kind of over there. And even when I came 25 years ago to Lutheran Child and Family Services, we did only very little work at that time with families. Children stayed in care for a long, long time, and they were basically operating without family input. And many times these children never returned to their families. Now, yeah, they never returned to their families as part of the plan, but they actually many times returned because they wanted to have a family. And so they were looking for them and we're hoping for them. And so many years ago, we have totally changed our model and introduced family models, intensive home-based, and all of these type of services to our program. Of course, we have not called this a 2-gen model. What we did is we had a clear interest in engaging families, but on a much more narrow vision that was basically dealing with parental opportunities to engage their kids, behavior management, those kind of things. But it was probably about 6 or 7 years ago that I first heard about 2-gen, and I was immediately intrigued by the model. So I made myself, I think I shared that at some time at some other conferences, and I use it as educational too, and we can do a little bit more, but I made myself these little silos, and this is here, this white one is called Early Childhood Education. And it really looks at all of this world that is outside, that is in childhood education outside my little silo. This is mine here. It's very long and narrow, because if you want to be a child in the child welfare system, it's not as easy to get in, but there's a lot of services available, and you might stay for a long time in it. And so this has to do with mental health and adverse childhood experiences and so on. So I made myself all these little silos. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. This one is here, post-secondary employment pathways. I have to tell you, very fascinating silo. I knew very little about it. I just knew about my own education and how to get ahead in America through graduate school and so on. But I didn't really know much about high school and how to get and all these wonderful programs. Here I have another one that I knew a little bit personally about, social capital. Never really heard about this before, but of course, it made very quickly sense how important it is to engage families and children together in settings, because one of the things that we have often seen in our families is that they are very socially isolated, and so when things become challenging, their resource level is very, very low, and then of course challenges immediately start. So I have been fascinated. Here's another one that I know very little about it until some time ago. Economic assets. We were never talking to our families about the economy. We were talking about how to get manage children's behavior and how to get along with each other, but we were never really much concerned about how people live. And I think this one is a real good one. Of course, I'm glad that I learned about all the different programs that, for example, Goodwill has, or I learned about some of the programs that you guys have over at Bonner Center, to engage families on this important issue. And so we will talk more about these, because I have used them in some trainings, and I think they're a good model for board to kind of figure out this complicated thing here. So anyway, that's me for right now.
Thank you, Sven. And I'm gonna come back to, because this is kind of a follow-up to that for all of you, because you're at different stages, I think, in your 2-gen journey, and maybe the way you've looked at 2-gen. I'm thinking back personally, I was at a community foundation when I first started doing 2-gen work, and I know immediately people became territorial, and it's like, well, if we start thinking about funding things as 2-gen, well, what about our education funding, or what about our funding that's for financial stability, or our funding for this? I don't want to mix that funding because it's inconvenient for me, right? That was the kind of the staff perspective, is I don't want to think about the entire family or how we can help everyone in different stages. I want to think about my silo. Good example, Sven, is that I'm focused on education, children's education, not adult education, and things like that. So I want to, and this will be, I think, good for our audience to hear, as you have implemented the work, or you brought your staff along, or your board along, or donors or funders, what has been the biggest challenge for you, to introduce 2Gen and get people to adopt it in your work. And Sven, you will pick back up with you and your silos about biggest challenges and what you've done to address that.
I mean, the challenge is that in our kind of expert lives in our areas, we are very good at something, but we are maybe not as good as at other things. And so there's of course an easy way to it. And you say, let's collaborate. We don't have to be experts in all of these areas. Let's bring some other folks together. Let's get Dean involved and Joseph, and Dean knows something about it. Now, yeah, I have to say, it sounds always easier than it is to do collaboration, because there are many reasons for that. But it takes a lot of trust. It takes a lot of maybe giving up some centers of control and a number of issues. So it always has to been a little bit of a challenge to work with the model. But because you get into some territories that are not really your expert areas. That's why I made all these things, these little silos up, because I have to kind of have a visual way of how can we knock down some of these walls, you know. And of course, I'm from Germany, and Ronald Reagan came to Berlin and he said, tear down this wall, and he was very successful in that, because it showed the craziness of having these walled areas. Of course, it's not this difficult, and often conversations stop when it goes. And John, you're right, when it starts, when we are starting to talk about money and how we maybe share some of the resources we have. But we have been pretty good at knocking some of these things down. And what you find out is there in these other silos, like social capital, we have seen and learned a lot about from one of our wonderful friends, Paramount School of Excellence, what kind of wonderful things they do around the areas of social capital for their families, for their students' families. And it's just exciting to learn what's in these, you know, what's all hidden in there, you know. But it is not necessarily a natural response to working with each other, especially in social services, where some of us are pretty competitive in the way when it comes to funding and so on. But I get the sense that our funders and other folks have really enjoyed us as Lutheran Child and Family Services to be really open to the idea of collaboration, and that has been very positive experience.
Great, thank you. Dean, what about at your organization? Any challenges or obstacles that you faced when you tried to implement the 2Gen strategy?
Sure. With regards to, from kind of top level down, from our board perspective, they kind of took lead from our executive team. Our James Taylor is very forward thinking, and as well as Terry Bailey, looking at how our housing primarily was being used. And we were part of the Indianapolis Continuum of Care program, which is really a housing first model. And initially we had units that were occupied by families that had high incidences of mental health, chronic mental health issues and things like that. And at the time of that relationship, we had a strong partnership with the mental health agencies. And at some point there was a shift, and primarily I would say due to funding in the system, where we did not have that on-site engaged mental health partner. And so really we were not helping families and individuals to live their best life, because we were not staffed to manage those chronic mental health issues that were presenting. And so there became a conversation with our board, leadership and board, on how could we better support families that were currently living, you know, could we find other housing that had greater supports for those mental health challenges? And so not at any time trying to unhouse individuals that needed that housing support, but really leveraging partners within the community to better support that family, and then use our housing assets to support
perhaps more independent, or that were able to leverage the resources that we were stronger in, if that makes sense. So that conversation happened, and then there was that transition period around again in 2016, 2017. And then we began the work of bringing staff along. And again, that was really during the period of the Great Families 2020, and getting the adult team members and our youth team members to play well in the sandbox together. And it wasn't contentious necessarily, but I think John and Lutheran Family Services kind of brought up this whole idea. There are, we call them the invisible silos. And so within our adult team, we had kind of worked through that process probably, 6 to 8 years earlier, when we became a Center for Working Families, leveraging income supports, financial coaching, and career and workforce development. And we had those staff members on site and really literally working next door to each other. But it was not always an issue where it was a luck of the draw if someone who needed all three received all three supports. And so with the Center for Working Families model, integrated service delivery model, we learned how to tear down those individual silos and invisible silos. But then now we're talking from adult services to our housing to our children and youth, and how do we incorporate all of those? And they all had their own cultures and things like that. And so me as Chief Program Officer, I was sharing, the directors of each, we were sharing the vision of this 2Gen work. And then I was, hands off, letting it go. But then as we continued to kind of look back at the data and the engagement levels and things like that, it was very clear that there wasn't total buy-in with staff. And so I'm a foodie. So what do? We drag everybody in the room and feed them well on several different occasions, and kind of cast the broader vision of 2Gen. And what does that look like from the big picture, and drilled it down to their individual jobs. And so we're not asking you to do your job. Well, we weren't asking them to do a different job, but to do their job differently, if that makes sense. So they had absolute expertise in their youth work. We wanted them to continue to do that, but through a lens of, you're only going to be successful with Sally Smith if if Sally Smith's mom, grandma, or whomever is as strong as they can be, and the household is as strong as they can be. And so just kind of and again, still continue to do the work that you do, but lean on your other partners. And it began to raise issues when Sally Smith was kind of, we call it hair on fire. What's going on? And so, because many of our after school participants now are in our housing, well, there's a case manager, there's a financial coach, and there's a career coach that's tied to that house as well. And so the youth member can continue to do youth services, but then be at the table to share this concern. And so it's really just casting the vision, but I won't say there wasn't buy-in. I think it was everyone, but this is my job. So, I'm doing my job. So won't this all work out? And no, it's to do 2Gen well and impactfully. There's no my job, but your job. We're all in this together. What needs to happen on behalf of this child, this family? And it gets really messy, but that's kind of how we got to that. I don't know if you're going to circle back around the funder component, or
yeah, we're going to come back to funders.
Okay.
And so Dr. Paulus, what about you as this transition and staff and obstacles maybe?
The board was pretty easy to bring along. We talked about this in the context of our annual work plan, which is their main conduit to what's going on in the organization. And they saw this as a natural extension of what we're already doing with fathers, with kids, and with women. The staff offered 3 forms of resistance, not heavy resistance, but non-trivial. One was we already do that. Like Dean said, we're already serving kids through these partnerships. We're already engaging kids through family nights. Why do we need to do any further? Another was we have partnerships for that, which is to say we have partners who are doing these services. Why would we integrate them into our own organization, or even build new partnerships so that we can provide better services? And then the third was, the standard and entirely reasonable approach that we already have enough to do in order to serve our core customers, the fathers, effectively. How are we going to diffuse our attention like this? Part of that was a function of our structure, though. Over time, each of we had 3 departments historically: mental health and wellness, family services, which addresses the Strong Fathers class and related efforts to help fathers, and then employment services, workforce development. In order to kind of refocus the work, we reorganized our departments. We still have workforce development. We have family services, but they focus primarily on the people in the class. So the folks who are coming in and the folks who need services initially. We then created a separate department called family support. And the family support department's role is to build the kind of partnerships we need that will help us to serve families with things we don't do, as well as to align the things we do with a 2-gen approach. So, that did, we've achieved management and governance buy-in. Some of the line staff, particularly the ones who aren't engaged in family support, it's still an issue. We're doing this. Why are we doing this again? Well, because it's part of our 2-gen approach. So that's been an issue, but I would say overall, we're at least making steps toward getting organizational buy-in.
Yeah, that's great. So I my own kind of personal story. So again, when I was with the Community Foundation, I was working with a donor, and I was still working on my pitch on the 2-gen thing. And so I was trying to raise some money for the Community Foundation that would be dedicated to 2-gen strategy. So we had education funding, we had funding for single moms, we had funding for lots of different things, but there wasn't a particular fund that was the 2-gen fund. Our development team at the time, I was on the money outside, right? I'm the senior vice president of grants. I'm the money out. The money inside wasn't working with me, right? They were like, we've got all these things. We're raising money for so many things. We don't have time to raise money for 2-gen. And I said, all right, I'll raise my own money for 2-gen. Thanks. And you know what? I'll set up a fund. I was the first donor to the fund, and then went out and started to solicit donors that I had worked with successfully in the past. And in the first year, we raised $250,000 for 2-gen. So we had some money to spend. Now it was, how do we spend it well and work with partners like you that actually were implementing 2-gen programs. And I remember talking to a major nonprofit in our community at just the basic question, here's what 2-gen is, do you do it? And they said, oh, yes, we do. And I said, well, I understand how you work with kids. Tell me a little bit about how you work with the parents. And they said they meet with the parents every single day. And I was really blown away. I didn't know anyone met with the parents every day. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And they said, well, they drop off their kids. And so we see them at the front desk. They have to actually sign them in. And we say things like, how's your day? Is there anything we can help you with? And I thought, okay, I have to do a lot more explaining about 2-gen as we're moving forward. So that what some people think they're doing in 2-gen may involve 2 generations. I don't know if the outcomes are being measured the same way, but the process of how it worked. And then that donor that I was talking with, he said, and it was a he, so I can say he said, that I have absolutely no interest in trying to fund parents. I want to fund their kids. So I'm only going to give you money if you can tell me that the money's going to go for the kids. So what did I say? Yes. Of course I said yes, right? I will take your money for the kids, and I will get someone else's money for those kids' parents, because we're going to make 2-gen work. And I told the donor, what you care about those kids, and I'm sure you care about those kids' kids. When they're going to have kids in the future, that'll be your 2-gen model. It'll be these kids and whatever kids they might have. I'll get other donors to worry about their parents. So I think many of us have taken on these obstacles in different way, and it's good to see that you work through it. So now I'm not going to take any of this personally as a funder. I want to hear your horror stories or good stories about funding and working with funders on the 2-gen strategy. So let's go back. We'll go reverse order the other way and start with Dr. Paulus this time about how's the funding working for you with either philanthropists or with foundations or with individual donors, or tell us about that.
Our funders are comfortable with our 2Gen offerings to the extent that we can clearly relate them to something we're already doing. So, or to the extent we're able to present them as innovations. So, for example, we have historically relied on individual service plans to guide our interactions with participants. Here are the 5 things you want to accomplish while you're here. Here's, I can help you with A, B, C, and I can get you this organization to help you with D and E. So that the transition to discussing family service plans, where we do the same thing with the head of household, with their partner, and to a lesser extent with the kids, was not that much of a leap. So it worked fairly well for us to make that transition. Our historic offerings around family nights and family gatherings kind of served as a springboard to get us to simply expand our engagement with families. So we could say, you've already been here for family night. You've seen what that does. It gives people a chance to build, to some extent, bonding social capital. You've seen how well it works. So here's how we're going to take that to the next level. We're going to be intentional about our programming. We're going to create opportunities for parents and children to engage in activities together. And we're going to try to impart some learning that will benefit the families as a whole in the future. So, it was organic in a way, but I think it was also framed in a way that made it clear that this was the natural next step, if that makes sense. Now, I talked earlier about referrals as an excuse not to get more engaged, and I also want to be clear that engaging in 2Gen services has allowed us to build stronger partnerships with organizations that also serve primarily kids and women, because that's not our primary population. And so that too has been something that's been very helpful. As we've built those partnerships and built them up, it's really helped us to, nothing succeeds like success. And so as we build partnerships that help us to both meet participant outcomes and tell a good story, that's really helped us to bring our funders along.
I'm going to go to the other two, but I want to enter. This is the perfect time because kind of a question came along, is that the good story. So as a funder myself for the last 10 years or so, working with a community foundation and now a private foundation, I think that we are making some changes as funders, and I hope that others will come along. Measuring outcomes is not a simple thing, right? Very difficult, and Dr. Paulus, that's part of what you do, but this outcome reporting, I think I have seen what happened is we all wanted to tell great stories, right? Everyone's got their go-to story that's going to make a donor cry or make a donor write a check or whatever your goal is for the go-to story. And then we were a little light on data for a while there, right? And then the pendulum, I think, swung really hard the other way, and it became all about data. You got to report data. And I think it's coming back to the middle where, a good story backed up with some real good data is really the selling point. I think, Rachel, your question, as a funder at a private foundation, we have a lot more flexibility to say, I can come out there and see good work happening. I definitely want a good grant report at the end. But I think more grantees speaking up about the challenges they're facing with reporting and how hard it is that I, having worked at a nonprofit before I became a funder, know how much time we spent not providing good services because we were worried about filling out some stupid form to give to a funder. And very often, the ones asking the hardest questions were giving the least amount of money. So I'm getting a tiny, crappy grant, and I'm spending hours and hours and hours trying to put the right numbers in the right blocks so that you feel better about your job, right? If you want to feel better about your job, come out and do some work with me, right? I'm thinking as a nonprofit. I remember, again, as a funder once being so frustrated with a grantee on the phone as that we were approaching a grant deadline. I am sitting in my beautiful air-conditioned home in shorts and a t-shirt, right? And I am watching the clock tick, and I am so mad at April because I don't have her application in yet at 4 o'clock when the deadline is. So I know I've known April for 20 years. I pick up the phone and I call April and I'm like, April, what in the hell are you doing? I need to get this grant report in. You're screwing up my weekend. and I really can't hear her response so well because there's a lot of noise in the background. I'm like, April, are you listening? What are you doing? And she said, I am on the street feeding people. Can I call you back? Right? Headlights right in my face, good punch in the nose for me to say, all right, I am trying to meet an arbitrary deadline that I have established. She is literally feeding hungry people, and I am giving her some bullshit thing to do that is slowing down good work. So I think, as funders, we all have to be really careful about, and Dr. Paulus, you're in the evaluation space. Why are we asking these questions? What are we trying to accomplish? And how can we make it better for the end user, right? That's what we all have to think about. Yes, we all have boards and people we have to answer to, but I think being honest, I love when grantees are honest with me. I am not as always with my board, as honest with my board, because we have to really be careful about, lines of communication. But I think, Rachel, to your thing is going back and saying, here's what we think we're doing well. I want to try to help to make this fit into your grant requirements, whatever you need from us. Our county is really bad at this. I was the chair of our Human Services Advisory Council, and I would tell people don't apply for a county grant because it's not worth the time. You're going to be scrutinized by 20 people who are all getting paid to tell you what you could do better, and in some cases, not by people that have done any of the work ever in their life. So that's I wish I had a better answer for you, Rachel, but that's what's going on in my head. In addition to way underpaying nonprofits for the work they do, and also for not covering their actual costs. What it really costs you to deliver the program is what funders should be paying for, not I only want to pay for the program and not for keeping the lights on or making sure people can feed their own families is ridiculous. So I'm sorry for interjecting there. I will jump back in, and I think I left off with Dr. Paulus about your relationship with funders, and I think Sven was up next.
Okay, yeah. So we have, of course, our what I would call more professional relationships with our professional funders, and because of the work of the United Way here for many years, the groundwork on this 2-gen model was laid. What is, I think, for me more interesting is to present here today is our relationships with individual people, individual donors that really want to help kids. And it comes often a little bit around to the story, John, that you mentioned a little earlier, because there's some people that say, I just want to help kids. I don't really necessarily care about these parents, that did all these things. And that's where I think sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to understand where they come from, but at the same moment to explain our model that has, and then they say, oh, why are you getting out of your lane? Your lane is the kids, and now you want to do everything, and you're not a community, you're not a community center, you're not this and that. And so these are kind of interesting conversations that we had and have on the board level too, and so it's not it's important discussions to have, especially if you have a kind of a faith-based organization like we are, that have contacts and very important contacts with our churches, and many of them know our history, where we came from as an orphanage. The orphanage model is probably the anti-model of 2-gen, and so but that's how we came, where we came from, and they are still a wonderful, very, very committed people out there that in some ways still think that we are an orphanage, and we have conversation about it. But when they hear some of the amazing data that comes out of 2-gen models, they say, "Whoa, wait a minute, that sounds like interesting." For example, that the increase in income for families and how they are able to really take care of some of their business. And that's what people like. They like people to take care of their own business and maybe get out of this kind of difficult and challenging situation. I think we have seen this a little bit, where we have to bring our volunteers along with too. Is we have one of the large food pantries here in our community up in Lawrence Township, and we have several hundred volunteers. And we are giving out food. And with the 2Gen model, we kind of were starting to re-envision what a food pantry of the future would be, because we know that the bag of food is really only the tip of the iceberg.
Mm.
And it's what else is there that we could engage with? And Dean said earlier she likes to engage people around food. It's kind of it's a very powerful way, and so that's what we are looking at. For example, at a program like Sharing Place at, and there are some discussions to have with funders and with our friends about how do you why do you want to move away from food? And we say we don't really want to move away from food, but there are some other important issues that we might in that relationship around food are able to discover. Now, we just had a conversation with Gleaners because our wonderful partner in the community, our food bank, there are some federal guidelines on when you give out food of what you can talk about, in addition to it, and what kind of questions you can ask and how can you get engaged, because I think people want to make sure that that we are not having stipulations on giving out food, that you have to do this and that before you get your bag of food. But these are, I think, things that people are really more open to than maybe some years ago, to be beyond our sometimes narrow expertise or funding area. So not so many questions with our wonderful foundation friends here in the community, but more some of those with board, with individual donors that want to make sure that we are not, sometimes they think that we might kind of stray off the mission, know, and that's something to not to take lightly, because there have been a lot of folks that have strayed off the mission, and the next thing you know, they're in some deep trouble because they are not really doing anything really well. Mm-hmm. They might have to be stuffed a little bit back into their silo again. And so anyway, that's kind of maybe an added point when I think about funders. It's lots of conversations with individual people like we are that want to know what's going on.
Great, thank you. Dean, anything you can add to that from a funder, donor perspective?
So I think from Bonner's perspective, we have the additional opportunity because we kind of the 2Gen model, the Aspen Institute model, we have a lot of that programming and service already incorporated into our organization. The various departments kind of feed those areas and support that work. And so for us, what we are doing, it's more of an internal navigation and altering and things of that sort, because when we are talking to a funder who wants to support only workforce development, or that's just what they do, we don't have to ask them to do that any differently. We're going to take those resources and manage them internally into this new model. And so for us, our 2Gen work is kind of capsulated, or that's a word. I keep saying capsize, but I know that's not it because you're upside down. So anyway,
don't want to be capsized.
Right, I know. So the idea is our model is the Indy East Achievement Zone. And so in that model, we're talking about thriving children, resilient families, and vibrant neighborhoods. And in all of those areas, we have committed funders that do great work when it comes to our youth services and those kinds of things. We have great partners that do our workforce development, our financial coaching services, and they continue to do that. Now they get the added bonus. Because of our 2Gen model, we can tell those stories, those deeper stories that will have much longer lasting impact. So we get that, they get the added bonus, but we didn't really ask them to do anything different. Now, I will say having United Way that has this really focus and drill down in the Family Opportunity Fund to really, so that we can really look at it and turn this model on its head and figure out what else we can do and how else we might be able to tweak the work, that makes it very viable. But again, that's an easier ask because they have already come to the table and agree that this is the right a promising approach. And so I think for us, it's more internal. How do we really incorporate or integrate all of our service areas, all of our program and organizational assets to really leverage the benefit? And so the great funding that's coming in to support our youth, the great funding that's coming in to support our adult services, we can do that and still continue to manage and support those individual folks who don't have children or who all I need is for you to help me find a job, and that's all the involvement that they want. We can still do that, but then drill down with the families in our Housing Stability for School Success program and really look at what are the best practices, what's the frequency and involvement. And again, and then on the outside, from the funder's perspective, they get the added benefit of those outcomes, I would say. And we do lift up our 2Gen stories. So, yeah.
Yeah, the story's great. I think thinking of working with donors, Sven touched a little bit on this. So foundations, you're going to have to deal with that foundation model, whatever it is, until we can figure out how to fix some of the things that we don't do well at foundations. But with individual donors, I have found in my experience with working many of them is that the best approach is go in to listen to the problem they want to solve, right? You don't need a bunch of fancy literature. What's the problem they want to solve? Write that problem down on a piece of paper. Now I've got to note what they want to solve. And then you can come back to them and show how you can solve that even better with a 2Gen model, or link them with other donors that want to solve the same problem and show how you can attack it in different directions. Crystal had a good question. Question for me as a funder who supports 2Gen and believes it. What did we do? Similar to United Way, many years ago, we hosted our very first 2Gen summit in Sarasota. I brought down some of my fellow Aspen fellows to talk about 2Gen. And then we set up a separate session for people who didn't compete with each other, if you understand what I mean, for funding, and said, how can sit at a table together, come up with something that you're struggling to accomplish, figure out how you could do it better together, and we'll fund it. And we didn't throw millions of dollars at it to start with, because that's not the way to prove a program is going to work. We said, come up with some ideas, come up with a reasonable budget, and let's pilot some things. They have all got so much better in Sarasota. We are very lucky that we have a community foundation very focused on it, a private foundation that funds it, and other foundations in United Way that support it. They get the 2Gen approach and they look for ways to work together. It's frequently money that screws it up, right? Because if you are dependent on a stream of funding, wherever it's coming from, you don't want to blow that. You don't want to mess it up. So as funders, we have to have some responsibility to say that money's not going to change. Either this is a new pot of money, or we're going to work together to figure out how everyone's getting their share. That the money is the part that frequently screws it up. And then one more kind of follow up to that question on how we do this well. So I, again, as a funder, we were funding a program at a Title I school that was really focused on kids. We wanted to make it a 2Gen program. So we said, we're going to offer classes for the parents. And notice the way I just said that on the offering. Somewhere during this crazy process, it became mandatory for parents to attend the classes. So we couldn't agree on the classes. Someone offered a financial literacy class. We got the program started. We said, absolutely. So as the funder, I wanted to go and see how the program was going. Walked into the financial literacy class, immediately identified an African-American female in the back who was nodding her head as the instructor was speaking, looked like she was taking notes. And I thought, that's who I'm going to talk to, because she's going to validate this idea that we're offering these wonderful classes to parents that are mandatory. Spoke to her after the class and said, so how did it go? She said, it was great. I said, did you learn anything? She said, not a thing. I said, how could you not learn a thing? She said, I have a master's degree in finance. And I said, well, what the hell were you doing in the class? And she said, some idiot made it mandatory. Well, I was the idiot who made it mandatory, right? And I said, now I feel really bad about this. And she said, well, I'm going to make you feel worse because I had to miss a shift at work and I had to hire a babysitter for my kid. So here's what you've done by making this class mandatory. We've become friends since then. But this idea of speaking with the parents, right? Talking with the families that you serve. What do they want? What do they need? What experience have they had with nonprofits in the past? If you say to them, oh, I've got a perfect nonprofit for you to work with, and they go, right? They're not culturally competent. They don't know how to work with my family. it's as a funder, this is kind of the Crystal's question, is telling partners and being very honest with them is, again, back to the same thing we said to the donor. Here's a problem that you want to solve. Here who I think the best partners are to solve it. And then testing it out and make sure it's so personality driven too, is that all of you that work at organizations, you can have one change at one person in one organization, and a 2-gen program that was working really well suddenly isn't working as well because someone, an idiot like it becomes too prescriptive about exactly what has to happen instead of addressing the needs of the family. Any comments from the panel as I read this next question in the audience? Someone stretch the time out for a second while I'm reading this next question to myself.
I think maybe one comment that I have seen with all of our funders, people are becoming more sophisticated in knowing the difference or trying to learn about the difference between outcomes and outputs. And many of us as traditional social service folks, we still love the old outputs and basically telling how many people we served and how many pounds of food we gave away, and they are good stories. They are important because it has to do how to reach folks. But I think it's more challenging for us to really get to the outcomes and to the data. And of course, I'm only partly speaking about myself, but I became a social worker partly because I wanted to work with people and not with numbers. And so we're learning, trying to get systems involved that we can really measure what our results are rather than what our good intentions are.
And to your point, I think it's okay for the staff that come to work every day for the individuals and the families that they're serving to let them do that now. What we need to do is, what is the data pieces, being very clear, asking what questions do we really need to be asking, and then how do we enter that information. I will say for my team, and they spend a whole lot of their time putting data into multiple systems. And so for a challenge for funders, we had gotten to a place at one point where many of the funders in Indianapolis for around the Center for Working Families had agreed upon a common metrics and a common report. And so whatever report, they just said, that works for me. And then just over the years, I've seen them kind of go back to their own corners and create new systems for folks. And so for us, we're investing, and we have the capacity to invest in a data team that understands all of those systems, and we use one as the point. But I will say that the team and they're doing excellent work with families, but sometimes we feel like we have to beat them over the head constantly because they didn't put the data somewhere. And I'm a firm believer, if it's not written down, if it's not in there, it didn't happen. But I think from a funding perspective, and as this work continues, and especially if there's a network of funders, if there's an opportunity to return back to that common reporting, not necessarily system, but report, would be helpful to the team, because we can get it in and report on it and show the work that's happening without the onerous task for staff to go in and out of multiple systems to get the story written down. Yeah.
I'm going to do another plug for grantees and people actually doing the work to really try to communicate with funders, foundations, and donors, right? Is that hearing, I think too often grantees, and I don't want to screw up anybody's relationship, too often grantees feel like you have to do exactly what the funder has asked you to do. In many cases, we are sitting back going, wow, I wish I would get some straight information from someone. How can I create a relationship with someone at that nonprofit to say, you're really working as hard. For what reason? What is the question you have to answer, person? And I'll answer that question for you. But for you to ask me 50 questions and you really only need to ask me 2, you've wasted 48 questions that really aren't helping any of us get any better at what we do. So we really do encourage that at Burancik, and I know they do at the community foundations. You've got to find the right person at these foundations that you work with to have good conversations with, or we could shift the burden to the foundations and say they should be having these conversations with you. and have you feel comfortable about responding honestly, like my friends have responded to me. Naima, your comment is lovely. I'm going to be really careful about politics here because I get threatened with that frequently. So this idea about working on equity, I was on a call yesterday with our local Science and Environmental Council, and I can't tell you how excited I was to be on a call with them to talk about justice and diversity and equity and inclusion, that it was the Science Council that wanted to have this conversation about how they could do better work in that space. The equity conversation is so uncomfortable for so many in our country. I think I heard a U.S. senator recently say there's no systemic racism in the United States. So how you're dealing with that issue is probably a whole separate session that you and I should set up and talk about separately, because it is clearly something, if we think 2Gen is challenging, taking on that issue is something that we all should spend a lot more time on.
Right. Very important.
Patty, on the very small preschool, obtaining funds. So here's one way to maybe think about that, and I'd love the panel if they can see the same question, is that what are we competing for? If it's for dollars, then I would say hopefully your overhead is smaller, right? So that you may not need as much money as some of the big ones. And I would like to think that you may have a little more flexibility to say, we want to try some 2Gen programming. We, when I was at the Community Foundation, intentionally went out and found a very small minority-owned daycare center that we were sure could produce exceptional results on school readiness. But we didn't just say to them, go do school readiness. We said to them, what are the tools and things you're going to need to prove this model? Their scores were unbelievable, and they did much better than some of the heavily funded, much more expensive preschools. So I think Linda can put my contact information in the chat box for everyone. If you want to talk about some strategies that we have used locally for daycare, preschool, early learning centers, and how to get funding and things that they can do, I'm glad to talk to you about that. If any panelist has any other ideas about that question.
I would say to Patty, also think about the community centers that are near you who are doing some of the program, maybe the adult support programs, and maybe bringing them in to support the families that you serve. We did that with our 2Gen now, and I think the more natural involvement or the kind of enveloping the community center or that agency in the work that you do will have greater outcomes as well. And so it may not be necessarily bringing the resources to you, but other agencies that have the resource to do the work that you're trying to do and strategically incorporating them in your efforts would be a way.
All right. I'm going to go kind of off the questions, the path here. So in the 2Gen, so a part of when I was doing the fellowship, during the fellowship, initially Aspen was saying that the 2Gen strategy was to break cycles of poverty, right? That was kind of their messaging. It was to break down cycles of poverty that some of the fellows said, and I agreed, was very kind of, it had a negative tone. They've kind of switched it up now to this creating intergenerational cycles of opportunity. Right? Think of just how different that sounds. Creating intergenerational cycles of opportunity. Who can be opposed to that idea? Right? Doesn't everyone want to create intergenerational cycles of opportunity? Rich people get to keep their money, right? They're going to pass opportunities. Middle-class people keep doing it, and everyone else also gets to increase their opportunities. I wanted you to think, panelists, as we go around, just kind of the 2Gen model, and maybe Sven could hold up his silos again. What has been the most challenging piece of 2Gen for you to communicate or for you to take on yourself and say, all right, I totally get this. Economic supports, I get that. Social capital, I get that. What are there any pieces of the 2Gen model that you have found have been either your go-to, so I'll give you the option, your go-to when you're saying to someone, this is why 2Gen is so good because think of this, or when you really struggle and say, boy, I hope they don't ask me about that part. So I'll give you each 3 seconds to think about it, and I will go to Sven first.
Yeah, I'm holding up this one here, and it's post-secondary employment pathways. And I have found out that it's a whole world by itself. And of course, it very quickly involves money, because you're not just showing up at some place without any resources, but it is really a tremendous world out there, and it's often enough the world that our clients know the very least about too. Many of our clients have never been to college. Many of them actually have never graduated from high school. And so it's kind of a world that I think sometimes we might be a little bit ahead of ourselves in regards to recommending this. This is not an issue for, people that know what this is really all about. But it's a big industry in our country. And every day there are new ideas, I mean, just think about, I have been involved a little bit in conversations about manufacturing and jobs in intelligent manufacturing, and sometimes it changes too. Many years ago, nobody knew what logistics is, but just think about how many jobs are in that area now. And there's hardly any mid-sized city in the country where that's not an important factor. So that's kind of, if it would be just community colleges like Ivy Tech, it would be relatively easy, but there's so many players out there that it makes it most difficult for me. So this is a big one for me.
That's yours. Okay, what about you, Dean?
Probably the social capital, not so much that I don't understand it and can't get around it. And we actually have a couple of ways of creating those opportunities for folks. But I think how to quantify and share that with the funder, they even may get it theoretically, but again, how do you show that there's been some gains in that area and those kinds of things? And so that's probably the biggest challenge. Not that I discount its importance by any means. It's just how do you convey that? And then for staff, I think we've gotten them to kind of wrap their arms around all the different components pretty well. I think when you talk about a family, we don't say to Jen to our families at all. We just kind of work with them and those kinds of things. And they have goals that relate to the 5 areas perhaps. But one of the other challenges I would say is that seeing movement for families. And so we take an example of a family that she's mom is working, but probably not at their greatest potential because there's this educational component that she has yet to circle back to. Again, we can say, put our finger on if you took on the post-secondary education and those kinds of things, challenge, or it might even be their secondary education, right? Supporting her and having her lock in on that has been challenging. And so then, of course, we're wanting to see, she's very much in the numbers of someone that may not have a high school diploma or limited post-secondary, but really wanting to see her on the other side of that. That's going to show up in the numbers, right? And so explaining what the length of time it might take for her to get to that place is a challenge as well. And how do we do that?
Great. Thank you. Dr. Paulus.
It's interesting. Our biggest problem, I think, is the elevator speech. It's explaining to folks who don't have the time to listen to how everything fits together. We can explain discreetly, workforce development. I can tell you that folks come in here with an income averaging $8,000 and they go out with an income averaging $16 an hour. That's easy. But talking about how all these disparate elements fit together has been a big challenge. The way that we've managed to deal with that is through stories. We can talk about the experience of a certain individual who received the full range of services, not so much talking about the services, but talking about the impact on the individual or the family. And that's really been what has helped address that, even internally. in conversations about why we're doing this and why we're doing this, we talk about individuals who have succeeded because of what we've done with them, I should say. So I mean that I think is the biggest challenge.
Great.
Thank
you
for us.
So I just giving a little example for the grantees out there. I was thinking about it. A small tweak that one program made in Sarasota that changed 2Gen for in my head for a lot of the things you talked about is we have one birthing hospital in Sarasota County, Sarasota Memorial, where almost all the babies are born. They added one question to their checkout screening as moms were leaving, and it was basically, are you food secure? Do you know where your next meals are going to come for the next week? It was just a yes or no, right? So if they were good, if it was no, it was automatically referred to our food bank, who assigned a case manager to make sure that mom and baby were going to get a home visit right away, and food was going to be lined up for them going forward. Mom and baby, 2Gens, right? So we've already got a 2Gen program there. And then we just built onto that. Maternal depression, all the other things that you can focus on. It was added one question to one survey. So when, instead of handing them a packet of referral slips that they would never, probably didn't even make it to the car, you got a car seat, you got a baby, go home. And here's a book of all the people you can call. That question started a whole program that has instant contact with those families to make sure they're getting fed. All right, so thank you all, my panelists, amazing panelists. So I know you're already all clapping at home and cheering for those amazing panelists. What I would like to encourage you all to do now is make sure that you fill out the survey. So at the end, we want these summits to continue across the country. I do personally, so that's why I'm sitting here in Sarasota, and most of you are not. 3 years ago, I think I was there in person and had a blast doing it, and I want to do more of these in person. We should be doing 2Gen summits across the country. Huge shout out to the United Way for doing it. If you thought it went well, Whitney and Linda get all the credit. Say nice things to them and their bosses about all the good work Linda and Whitney did. If it didn't go well, send an email to Sven or someone and realize you're probably responsible for not getting anything out of this. You take some responsibility for that. So I want to thank you all again. Please, there was some magic code that you needed to know too that I saw popped up. Did everyone get that 2123? 2123 was the last game code for today. So good luck to you playing the game. And thank you all. I wish we could have done this in person because I would like to continue the conversation with many of you. And my email was in the comment box. If you have any questions or if there's something I can help with you, please do reach out. Survey Monkey just popped out. Positive comments only. Whitney didn't say that. John said that. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good to see you all. Thank you. Keep up the good work.